would like to call to order this October 2nd, 2017 regular meeting of the Sonoma City Council. Mr. Ross, would you do the honor of leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance? All please rise.
I pledge allegiance to the flag under the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ms. Clerk, can I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Harrington.
Here.
Councilmember Agramonte. Here. Mayor Pro Tem Edwards.
Yes.
Councilmember Cook.
Here.
Mayor Hunley.
Here.
Thank you.
We did not have our closed session beforehand, so we have no report to give on that. At this time, we have approval of the agenda. If there is any discussion or action from the council.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll second that.
Can I get a roll call vote, please?
Aye.
Councilmember Agramonte. Aye. Mayor Pro Tem Edwards.
Yes.
Councilmember Cook.
Aye.
Mayor Hunley.
Aye.
Thank you.
Item number 1, comments from the public. At this time, members of the public may comment on any item not appearing on the agenda. It is recommended that you keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. Under state law, unless otherwise permitted under the Ralph M. Brown Act, the merits of the matters presented under this item cannot be discussed or acted upon by the council at this time. For items appearing on the agenda, the public will be invited to make comments at the time the item comes up for council consideration. Upon being acknowledged, or you can go ahead and step up, please step to the podium, speak into the microphone, begin by stating and spelling your name. Mr. Brown.
Thank you. Ken Brown, BROWN, 1396 Lubeck Street in Sonoma. We have an event coming up, How Cannabis Treats Diseases, Sunday, October 15th from 2 to 4 p.m. at Vintage House Senior Center, 264 First Street East in Sonoma. They are a wonderful partner, and we're looking forward to this. There's no cost. Donations are accepted. Dr. Jeffrey Hergenrather, a cannabis physician practicing in Sebastopol. He is the president of the Society of Cannabis Clinicians. He will be our main speaker. Deborah Caldwell is the founder and formulator of Topicana Cannabis Creams. She is an advocate for cannabis therapy to reduce pain and inflammation. My lovely wife, Jewel Matheson, a breast cancer survivor and cannabis activist with Sonoma Patient Group, will be the facilitator. This educational forum is sponsored by Sonoma Patient Group, a nonprofit. I must add, this is not a program, nor is it endorsed by Vintage House. For more information, you could contact Jewel at 707-480-5639. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ann Colachidas, Ann no E, Colachidas, Colichidas, 14 Hacienda, Sonoma. I want to thank Mayor Hundley for this lovely proclamation and for Councilmember Harrington for coming out to our Renters Week of Action rally on September 22nd to declare the Renters Week of Action, the September 18th through 24th, as part of a nationwide mobilization of renters. So I want to thank you very much for being there and for putting Sonoma on the map for this National Assembly. When we did a little bit of evaluation at the housing group, we started talking about really what is a renter. It's such a broad category. It could be someone on a waiting list waiting to get into affordable housing. It could be someone who's in some affordable housing and hoping to preserve it, someone who might be being evicted, someone who's been a past renter, someone who's homeless. It could be land trust. So it's such a huge category that to talk about it and it's in a generalization does it a disservice. And so I would really like to ask the council at this time to consider holding a town hall on housing so that we can sort of start unpacking these things and figuring out what are the priorities for our community. And also, as Sonoma has, a lot of influence in the region, it'd be really, I think, useful to start finding out what we can all do together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, council members and everybody. People ask me, do you want anything else? I want everybody to have a good life. My name is Ted Sexauer. I live at 12 Hacienda Drive in Sonoma, and I'm currently the Veteran Service Officer for VFW Post 1943. And I'd like to let you know that we're different than most posts. We really look out after each other and are really invested in community affairs. Not only that, but we are very well adjusted. We're amongst ourselves. We're close to losing our last World War II vet, but other than that, we have, and that was, anyway, other than that, we're represented by all ages in the post, and we all get along very well. I stand now, I rise, because I attended the planning commission meeting this last Thursday, where they're speaking about the Altamira available housing project. As you probably know, they kicked it just a little ways down the road. I think they're going to bring it up during their first meeting next month. And so basically, I'm saying that our posts, both American Legion Post, VFW Post, and Vets Post, are all behind this. I will be the coordinator and the person to speak with. And further, a question arose at the commission meeting. What if these guys are all homeless? Some of them may not have vehicles. How will they get to the VA clinic in Santa Rosa or to the VA hospital in San Francisco? The answer to that is we cover our vets. We have a committee, volunteers who offer rides just for those purposes. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Council. I'm Cecilia Ponison, and it's spelled Ponicissan. I live at 175 France Street, and we're closing in on living here for 20 years. And I have some questions that I had wished to pose to the council, but I actually sent them to the paper first, hoping that maybe there'd be some response. And in fact, I was delighted to see that the budget was put on the website. I asked the question of what was the current City of Sonoma budget. I checked it, and it says it's a proposed budget. So I'm wondering, when does it become the final budget? And the letter that the city manager wrote was dated in June. So now my question is, when does a proposed budget become a final budget? The other question I had was, has the council developed a license application for a medical marijuana dispensary or for sales of recreational marijuana? And I'm wondering, what does it require, and has anyone applied if such an application exists? Also, where and how will drug testing be done when the new marijuana law takes place in January? And the other thing I was wondering is, does the city have a disaster plan or a committee in place? We've seen enough terrible things happening that maybe it would be a good idea, if that isn't in existence anymore. I hear that once upon a time there was such a committee. Maybe it's time to think about having another. I know that I was in another city visiting once. In their center town, they had a park, and they had a big fair showing everyone in town what to do in case of an emergency. They were given routes to follow if they were ever asked to leave the town in case of a fire, which ways to travel, who to call for help, how to deal with animals. Luckily, here in Sonoma, we have people who will help with even large animals like horses. So there are a lot of things that could be given as information, even if it's just a sheet of paper, if you're not willing to put on a safety fair, which is pretty much what this was. And it was hugely attended. There were so many people there who needed that information and who wanted to be prepared. The gas company was there showing them how to deal with gas lines. The water company was there. First aid was there. So might be something to think about in the future, and make it so that Sonoma knows what to do and how to help their neighbors in the case of an emergency. I hope we don't have one, but they keep saying we're going to have the big earthquake, so why not be prepared for it? Thank you very much. Good
Thank you.
night.
Hi, Fred Allebach at 19550 8th Street East. And I'm here to talk about the Satellite Affordable Housing Project. I was there from the very beginning when they made their first presentation at the Altamira School. And I was on the Community Advisory Committee. And we reviewed the plans and had 4 meetings about the project, and the architect and the developer made some important changes to the project, like moving the entrance, getting rid of 3 stories, moving the community building, moving the area of the trash, even down to the colors of the buildings possibly. So I guess I kind of naively figured that everything was covered and it would just sail through. So I was a little surprised when the Planning Commission didn't approve it this last meeting. But I guess, knowing from the way things go in town that people are going to take issues as far as they can. And so I think that given that, with this project, it's likely that this may not get built for a number of years, given the possible appeals and things that could happen to it. And so it's very needed. And I think that given that it would be a good idea for the council to consider upping the inclusionary rate for housing projects here from 20% to 35%, and to work to get the in lieu fees and that process there with the Nexus study, get that online so that those monies can start to come in to support affordable housing developments. Because if the main project that's supposed to address affordable housing may not happen for years, I think that you have to press this on all fronts, and I think that the 35% inclusionary rate would be a good idea, and I don't see why it couldn't be done. And so those are my suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dave Ransom. I live in Santa Rosa. I go to church in Sonoma, and so I have a sort of an outsider's viewpoint, and particularly as I've only lived in the area for 5 years now. I hear so many people talk about not changing the character of the city, and yet what I see is a city in the process of changing character. And a lot of those who don't want to change the character of the city are the ones who are changing it. If I remember what David Goodison wrote some time back about the property on Broadway, it was a little farmstead to start out, and the sense that if people who would find that sort of life affordable, and the people in town who have lived that sort of life would not be appropriate to live there now is a little strange. In our church, I have had a lot of one-on-ones with people who have lived in town forever, except that they don't live in town anymore. They can't afford Sonoma, they live in the Springs. Or they have moved since I came because they can't afford to live in town. Or some of them have gone homeless because they can't afford to live in town. And I know all of you have stood up for housing in Sonoma. I hope we'll have a way to make sure that that Broadway project happens with the most housing available. It's just a part of the solution, but it is part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Armando Zimmerman, Zimmermann, and I live on West Spain Street. To begin with a question, just wondering about the smoking ordinance guidelines. I assume they're not out. I still see people smoking in the plaza, and I'm wondering also whether cannabis or marijuana smoking guidelines would be included with the tobacco smoking guidelines, because I see that occasionally in the plaza on Tuesday nights and so forth. I don't really mind myself, except I don't like the smell, but I do mind when I'm there with my grandkids. So I don't see any signage indicating that the guidelines are out. So unless I'm out to lunch, maybe they're not out yet. So those are the questions. Secondly, I read an article in The Sun just recently talking about the Shotgun Hill proposed development and the 5,000 square foot pads. And it didn't enlighten me or inform me too much, other than what I heard at a meeting not too long ago, which was it was just a starting place, it sounds like. And so I just have some questions about that, and I'm hoping that there's going to be some clarification, especially for the new planning commission or from the new planning commission. Let's see. The third one is I went to the city hall a few weeks ago, asking for some information regarding the expenditures in regard to the Sonoma Valley Visitors Bureau, and I was given a report. I was given a report, Sonoma Tourism Improvement District Corporation. So I walked off, and then I sat down and read it, and basically it didn't answer any of my questions regarding what's really being spent and totally in regard to tourism, at least unless I just missed it in there. So I came back to the city hall. They said, go over to the Visitors Bureau. So I did, and there were two fellows there. One of them, I think, was a director, and I just said, hey, is there a report available that would inform me in regard to what's being spent, salaries, et cetera, et cetera. And basically he looked at me and said, no, yeah, there's going to be, but you'd have to request it from our board. And so at that point, I just kind of turned around and left. So that's just another question. Maybe you can't answer it tonight, but I'm hoping that if I'm wrong on trying to find this information, or is it confidential, or what, or how can I find it? So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Christine Mismer. I cannot give you a current address because I'm currently displaced. I've had a lot of difficulties in the valley. Over the last couple months, I've been searching for housing for myself and my daughter, who's now 11 years old. And it's a very difficult commodity to come by when you live on a very low income. I'm a mother of a girl who is considered special needs, and I am on call 24 hours a day, no matter where myself or my daughter are, to be able to take care of her. I'm currently not working because I have to be available to her all the time. I'm currently a recipient of the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. There's been a lot of discrimination when it comes to this program. It's very concerning. I've lived in Sonoma Valley for the last 17 years. The first house I moved into, I was there for 14 years, and the last place I was at, I was there for almost 3.5. And I consider myself to be an upstanding citizen of this community. I'm involved, I'm interested, I care about the individuals who live here. I care about the people who work here. And I'm very concerned about our futures. I've been looking now for a place to live for a couple of months, and like I said, there's been some discrimination around the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. Affordable housing is very difficult to come by, and I know that there's a project coming up, the Saha, over on Broadway across from Traintown, and there's been some questions about it, and there's some neighbors that aren't quite liking the certain aspects of the project. But when it comes down to it, we're talking about individuals from 5 houses. And this project is going to be looking at housing over 100 people. 100 people that are currently looking for housing but can't find it. And it's very important that we consider people other than ourselves and look at the overall aspects of what this situation with the lack of housing is doing to people. And I really hope that if this matter comes before you, that we find a way to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment at this time? Seeing none, I will bring it back to the council.
Madam Mayor and Council, there were a few questions I think I can answer quickly from members of the public if that's helpful. So one, just generally, if members of the public have questions, they can always just email cityhall@sonomacity.org. It's easy to remember, cityhall@sonomacity.org, and we'll send it out to the appropriate staff member and send an email back to make it convenient for folks. I just want to clarify the current city budget is up on the website. It is a July 1 through June 30 budget, and it does, so the city manager's budget message is a June date, but that is the current budget. We have a new website that we're actively working on, and we hope to roll in the next 2 weeks and make it a lot easier to find information and a much nicer kind of interface. So we're looking forward to that and being able to add more information. There were some questions on cannabis, and we're going to be coming back at our next council meeting talking more about regulations on the intermordants and cannabis, and that's probably a better time for that conversation. I can appreciate questions about disasters with everything that's been going on in the world lately. Just want to let council and community know we've had those conversations as staff as well. The city has an active emergency plan that was updated a couple of years ago. We're going to be doing training for our staff in October. The website also will have information and resources the public can use to go through. And so some of those are things that people can do self-help and make sure they've got their 72-hour packets ready, et cetera. So we are having some of these conversations, and we'll be putting more information out to the public. In terms of smoking, we've just put up smoking signs in the plaza, and that includes both cannabis, vaping, and regular smoking. So I think those are just a few things I can quickly answer. But again, folks should feel free, if they have more specific questions, either come by and see us or feel free to email cityhall@sonomacity.org. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, do we have any meeting dedications? As you all know, we woke up to some pretty horrific news about Las Vegas, and we would like to dedicate our meeting today for all of the lives that are lost and all of the injured, and we would like to have a brief moment of silence. Thank you all. Item number 4, the consent calendar. All items listed on the consent calendar are considered to be routine and will be acted upon by a single motion. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless members of the council, staff, or public request specific items to be removed for separate action. At this time, the council may also decide to change the order of the agenda. Are there any items that we'd like to remove for separate discussion?
I just wanted to pull the item on the easement.
Okay, item 4.2.
4.3, that is.
4.3?
Yes.
Yes. Any others? Okay, this time I'm moving on to the public for public comments on either of the items that have not been pulled, which would be 4.1 and 4.2, right? All right, seeing none, I will bring it back for action on the first two.
I'd like to make a motion to approve 4.1 and 4.2.
Second.
Can I get a roll call vote, please?
Councilmember Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Agramonte? Mayor Pro Tem Edwards?
Yes.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Mayor Hunley?
Aye.
Thank you.
Item 4.3 is adopt a resolution approving an easement agreement granting a water line and well easement on the city's property at East MacArthur Street and 2nd Street East to the owners of the MacArthur Place Hotel parcel at 29 East MacArthur Street. And I believe we're going to begin with our Public Works Director.
Yeah, well, we're happy to, just since it was pulled, provide just a brief overview for members of the public before we dive into a question from you, Councilmember Harrington. So this is Colleen Ferguson, our Public Works Director, which will basically briefly describe this item.
Okay, greetings, Mayor and council members. Back in 2000, November of 2000, the city was interested in acquiring property for completion of the Nathanson Creek Preserve and Bike Trail. And the property that was acted on by council at that time through a resolution and approval of a grant deed was a purchase of 1.1 acres across the creek from MacArthur Place. That property at that time had a well and easement, or a well house and a well, and pipes from that well and well house across the creek to the MacArthur Place property, and it was used to irrigate that property. So at the time that the city acquired the property across the creek from MacArthur Place for the Nathanson Creek Preserve and Bike Trail, the grant deed set aside access to, reserved to the grantor, so to MacArthur Place, continued use of that well and well house and the irrigation lines going over to MacArthur Place, so they could continue to use that well to irrigate the MacArthur Place property. And it also granted to MacArthur Place the rights to do maintenance and upgrade that well house in the future. So that transaction happened in 2000, and it was a grant deed that reserved rights onto the grantee from that grant deed, which was MacArthur Place as the grantee. And then in September of this year, the MacArthur Place property is changing hands. And in September of this year, we received a letter from IMH Financial Corporation requesting that the city grant an easement agreement in lieu of the reservation of rights that was in the grant deed to just clarify the title, clean up the title, do their due diligence in the property transaction as the transaction moved forward. And in response to that request, staff brought this easement agreement to council for action tonight that would grant a water line and well easement on the city's property at East MacArthur Street and 2nd Street East to the owners of the MacArthur Place Hotel parcel at 29 East MacArthur Street. So that's the basic background and how we got to where we are today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Ms. Harrington?
Oh, so in reviewing the packet, I asked the city attorney's office to provide me with a copy of the original resolution regarding this, a copy of the grant deed, and a letter from the purchaser so that I could have all of the information and compare it against the newly drafted easement. I received that shortly prior to this meeting and haven't had time to review it. I want to ensure that there aren't additional rights being granted that are unintended, and to compare it, to have the opportunity to compare the original rights to what the proposed new easement is. And I just wanted the matter continued until the next meeting so that I could look at the documents that I was just provided with.
Do we have are there any time constraints on behalf of the buyer?
The buyers would, of course, like action as soon as possible, but if it's deferred to the next council meeting, that's fine. it will work out fine. And this, the information, you can imagine the timeline was very quick from getting a request September 13th to having the easement agreement in the form it is to attach the staff report to council. And I, in hindsight, wish I had attached the grant deed and the prior information to the packet, and I apologize for not having that included in the first place.
And maybe just add one other item. I guess I would also say that I know that our public works director, Colleen Ferguson, and our assistant city attorney did work through this. The initial request from the future property owner was for an expansion of some of the rights under the easement. I just want council to know that part of the conversation we had with them was we were not interested in expanding those rights. They could maintain those rights, and that was fine. And so what staff has tried to do in the document in front of you is to limit it to maintaining the rights they currently had, and to also just clarify some things in terms of maintenance, indemnification insurance, those things that were not clear before. But just so staff, council, full council knows that was part of the work that was done, but there is not, if council wants to continue it, that can be done.
And so procedurally, to continue, would that be on a motion?
Yes.
So for the council, we have two options. We can either move forward to this, or we can entertain a motion for continuance.
Well, in favor of continuing it, I think that it's our due diligence as council members to review the prior deed before agreeing based on a staff report to sign a new easement. I think we should at least have the opportunity to read it since it wasn't provided. And I make a motion that this matter be continued to the next council meeting so that we can read the prior proclamation and deed prior to voting on this.
And just Mayor, public comment.
Yep. We skipped one important step. I'm sorry, public. At this time, we will go out to the public for public comment on this item. Seeing none, I will bring it back. Do we need a new motion, or can we keep our old? So we have a motion, we have a second. Ms. Agramonte, can I get a roll call vote, please?
Councilmember Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Agramonte?
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Edwards?
No.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Mayor Hunley?
Aye.
Thank you.
All right, that item, it will be continued until our next meeting. Next up is item 5.1, discussion, consideration, and possible action to conduct first reading and public hearing on the adoption of the second extension of an interim moratorium ordinance on the approval of applications for vacation rentals, including the adoption of a report specifying the measures taken to alleviate the conditions which led to its adoption. And we will begin with our planning director.
Thank you, Mayor Hundley, members of the City Council. About a year ago, the council adopted an interim moratorium ordinance on essentially halting any approval of new applications for vacation rentals. And the purpose of that action was to allow an opportunity for the city to study different permitting options and allowances associated with vacation rentals and make sure that those would be effective moving forward and that we wouldn't see new proposals be approved prior to that consideration. So under state law, there are strict time limits associated with any interim moratorium. The first allowance is for a period limited to 45 days. It may then be extended for a period of 10 months and 15 days. That extension was adopted by the council in November of last year and is due to expire later this month. A third extension is possible for one more year. Now, since the time that the interim moratorium was initially adopted, the council has discussed and provided broad direction concerning changes to the regulation of vacation rentals. And based on that direction, a draft ordinance has been developed that was reviewed by the Planning Commission at its meeting of September 14th, just last month. The Commission has voted unanimously to forward the draft ordinance to the City Council with some revisions, and that council review is tentatively scheduled for its meeting of October 20th. But that meeting occurs outside of the expiration of the current interim moratorium ordinance, and so we're here tonight to request the council to exercise its option to extend the moratorium for a final time. in order to ensure that there's no gap between an allowance for vacation rentals and the council's action on new regulations concerning vacation rentals. So that action would take a forfeits vote. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the council at this time? Seeing none, we will take it out to the public for public comment. No public comment?
Ann Colachidas again. Yes, please extend the moratorium one last time and see what we can do to make it permanent. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment on this item? Seeing none, I will bring it back to the council for discussion and action. Who would like to begin? Ms. Agramonte?
Oh, I was just going to make a motion.
Do it.
I'd like to make a motion, for an urgency ordinance of the City Council of the City of Sonoma extending interim restrictions on vacation rentals pending the consideration and study of zoning and other land use regulations pertaining to vacation rentals in the city.
I'll second it.
All right, so we go, and before we go to a vote, is there any discussion on this item? I think we've discussed it a few times in the past, so could I get a roll call vote, please?
Councilmember Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Agramonte?
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Edwards?
Yes.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Mayor Hunley?
Aye.
Thank you.
Item 5.2, discussion, consideration, and possible adoption of an interim urgency ordinance imposing a moratorium on wine tasting facilities in the Plaza Retail Overlay District and making findings that said adoption is exempt under CEQA pursuant to CEQA guidelines sections 15060C2, 15061B3, and 15308. And we will begin with our city manager.
Good evening, council, manager, and members of the community. We're going to start here. David Goodison, our planning director, is going to do the first part of the presentation, and then I'll do the second part.
All right, onward to the first part of the presentation. So just by way of some background, at your meeting of September 18th, the council held a study session on tasting rooms. At that time, a variety of different materials and information were presented by staff and discussed by the council and the community, including a review of the Sonoma's downtown and the transition that it's undergone, along with those of downtowns throughout the country, a review of previous regulations concerning the protection of the character of the downtown in different ways. For example, the establishment of the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, limiting office uses. We discussed definitions having to do with the regulation of alcoholic beverages and the differences between the license types between wine tasting facilities and wine bars. And that kind of brings us to this first slide. The discussion is concerning tasting rooms, and tasting rooms are operate under a very specific type of ABC license called a Type 2 license that allows a winery that might exist, for example, well, really anywhere, to operate an off-site tasting room under their existing Type 2 license. So the winery has a license to make wine under its Type 2, and under ABC regulations, they're allowed to have an off-site location in which where they sell that wine. And so that's commonly referred to as a duplicate license. Currently in Sonoma, the operation of a tasting room is considered to be a permitted use in the commercial zoning district. That means that there's no discretionary city review process that's required. And what that also means is that the city often does not know when or where a new wine tasting facility is going to arise. This is in contrast to the wine bar tap room use. That type of use operates under a Type 42 license. It's not associated with any specific winery, and typically a wine bar will provide tastings from multiple wineries. Under that ABC license, there's authorization to sell beer and or wine for consumption on or off the premises. But this type of activity is a conditionally permitted use in the commercial zoning district, meaning that use permit review is required. And so there are some key differences between these two license types and between these two use types that has essentially led to the focus on the tasting room type, because it is currently not regulated, at least through city discretionary review processes. Council also received information concerning how the balance of uses within the Plaza Overlay Zone has changed over time. And just to look at that very briefly, this map shows the difference between 2012 and 2017, where there's been about a 35% increase in wine tasting facilities within the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, which is the shaded area indicated on the slide. And of course, there are some tasting facilities located immediately outside of that area as well. That study session wrapped up with a council discussion. And through that discussion, several members of the City Council expressed interest in possibly adopting an interim moratorium on the approval of applications for new wine tasting facilities. And as we heard in the previous item before the council, the purpose of an interim moratorium ordinance is to pause or bring a halt to a certain activity in order to allow a community to review the regulations associated with that activity and possibly adopt new regulations. And we'll hear later on about some of the issues and restrictions associated with taking that type of action. But before we get to that, there are a variety of other considerations that the council will undoubtedly bring to bear in its discussion of this issue, and we tried to highlight some of those in the staff report. Those have to do with the diversity of plaza businesses and how that's evolved over time, vacancies in the plaza that may occur at key locations, and concern about what may or may not occur in those tenant spaces. As reported at the last meeting, in the consideration of tasting rooms, the lease rates on the plaza have increased substantially, and tasting rooms are simply able to pay a higher price than traditional retail. I've already reviewed the increase that we've seen in wine tasting facilities within the Plaza Retail Overlay District. And of course, as we heard in the previous meeting, there's been discussion and concern from residents, tasting facility managers and owners, and other businesses on the plaza about the need to maintain a diverse mix of businesses on and surrounding the plaza. We'd like to emphasize that current tasting rooms, although they weren't subject to any particular permit process, would be considered legal nonconforming if the city were to put into place a conditional use permit process in the future. That means that these locations are basically grandfathered and would not be subject to any new permitting requirements except on the loss of their legal nonconforming status or the existence of other limited circumstances. And as pointed out in the staff report, while the plaza is currently enjoying a low vacancy rate, there is continued interest from wine tasting facilities to come to Sonoma. As we'll see, there are 5 new wine tasting facilities in process based on the city's building permit and business license data. And the city is aware that there are current retailers who are considering adding a tasting room component to their current business model as a way to broaden their business operations. But again, without a permitting process in place, the city is not in a position to have a clear understanding of what is occurring until often very late in the process. And while there is much to be said for allowing the market to sort out the mix of businesses around the plaza, and over time it is often true that the market will realign and manage issues of overconcentration, there is often a transition time and transition implications while these market forces sort themselves out. And in Sonoma's case, the overall market area is fairly small. And so kind of broader market forces may not play out the way one might expect in a smaller geographic area. So we would like to update the council on wine tasting facilities that are currently in the permit process, because this has implications with respect to a potential moratorium. Oh, I've gone too far here. Go back. I'm sure it'll all work out. Here we go. Based on our review of business license records and building permits, we've identified 5 that are in process right now. There's an active building permit underway at 497 First Street West. There are building applications that are approved and waiting issuance of a permit for 2 more at 414 First Street East and at a tenant space at 27 East Napa Street. And then within the last 60 days, business licenses have been approved at 29 East Napa Street, Suite C, and at 452 First Street East, which is in the Mercado. So based on the preliminary council discussion that occurred in your, at your last meeting, these facilities that are in process would be exempt from the moratorium as it is currently drafted. The city manager is going to talk more about the components of the moratorium and what it's proposed to address and exclude. But I would like to just conclude my part by looking forward. The purpose of the moratorium is to enable the council to develop and implement new regulations concerning wine tasting facilities. Now, most likely that's going to be through some type of land use or zoning permit, quite possibly a conditional use permit. An approved conditional use permit is valid for that specific location and will, after its issuance, run with the property and remain valid for subsequent businesses at that same location. So that creates an entitlement that does not go away if a specific tasting facility closes. The property owner has the right to solicit another tasting room should that happen. Another point to remember is that each of the existing tasting rooms that are currently in existence and lawfully operating are also, as I mentioned previously, considered to be a legal non-conforming use. And these would be considered to be grandfathered in under any new permitting scheme that might be adopted. There are some circumstances in which they could be affected by new regulation. I don't want that to be a blanket statement, but those circumstances are fairly limited. So as pointed out in the staff report, that could occur, for example, when the city determines that a business is operating in a manner that creates a nuisance, or if a tasting room changes its or attempts to change its liquor license classification, if there are issues with the ABC permit, for example, if the license is revoked or suspended, or if there's a change in the mode or character of the operation of the establishment. For example, a facility that wants to expand would certainly be subject to new permitting procedures. And lastly, if the tasting room is abandoned or discontinued for a period of 1 year or more, then any kind of grandfathering entitlement goes away after that time. So we just want to emphasize that new regulations aren't a time machine. They're mainly prospective. They occur going forward. And while there are some circumstances in which new regulations can affect existing legal businesses, those circumstances are fairly limited. And so with that, I believe it's the city manager's turn.
Great, thank you, David. So just a few other comments. In terms of a moratorium, as council's aware, a moratorium takes a 4/5 vote. Urgency ordinance takes a 4/5 vote of the council. And as and typically an urgency ordinance of this would go in similar that we just looked at vacation rental, be for the total for 2 years, and it's typically goes in a 45 days, then a 10 months and 15 days, then you have to come back again and extend for 1 full year. Staff's looked at, we've already done some research and preparing for the study session. We think we've got, been able to do some things that will help us moving forward. And we believe that we want to move this kind of in an accelerated fashion. So our plan would be that in November through January, we'd be finishing our research and analysis, be going to Planning Commission in February or March, and try to be coming back to council in April, May. So we're only asking if you are going to do a moratorium, it's written that it ends June 30th. You could always extend one more time, but by doing that, it keeps some pressure on us as an organization to move this forward. and we would like to be able to do that if council's prerogative is to do a moratorium. As we look through a moratorium, there are really three kind of components. One is the use, and as David talked about, our recommendation is not to deal with the wine bars, but to only talk about tasting rooms, and so that is how the moratorium that's in front of you is drafted. The other is the question of geography. What are the boundaries? This could have been citywide. It also, the next step would have been the historical overlay, which is a little bigger. I mean, not as big as citywide. And then the next option was the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, and that's the map that you've seen in front of you. If David would go to the next slide, if council wanted to take it down one more level, your other option would be to take it to really just kind of around the core of those businesses directly facing the plaza. That was probably the most restrictive of a moratorium that you could, or the least restrictive, I guess, that you could place on that. And this does show, this map was a request from a council member, and it does show with the dots where the current tasting rooms are that are directly on the plaza. And the other item that is in the draft moratorium for you is the list that David put up exempting the 5 businesses that are currently either have active business licenses and or are building permit and have made a financial investment at a level that the city attorney recommends that they be grandfathered in. So just staff's recommendation is really, we are, as a community, we're known for our wine industry. Those are our roots. That is our overall primary economy. And it's definitely a part of who we are and how we're known. And yet, we also are known for our community character and being a place that as residents, we love to come and invest and live. So it was interesting when we talked through this with a variety of folks. We heard some consistencies. We heard a desire to maintain diversity in the plaza. We also heard that maintaining that special sense of place and community character that we have is important. And we also heard that local sourcing and a way to protect protect the Sonoma brand and the Sonoma viticulture, which potentially some of the other agencies have been able to do through some kind of a local sourcing, which still requires more research. But that is another thing that we could be wrapping in as we look at these regulations. So again, the recommendation from staff is to adopt an interim ordinance creating a moratorium on wine tasting facilities in the Plaza Retail Overlay, excluding the 5. Also approving, you would be approving first the first 45 days, and then we would be coming back to you. If you approve this today, we'd be coming back to you on November 6th to do an extension out to the June 30 in that accelerated manner. I would like to also come back and give you some routine updates as we move through, so you know things are moving along, both you and the community. And we would be looking at a variety of research and working with different groups if council decides to proceed and we bring this forward. So with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions of council or community.
Do you have any council questions? Vice Mayor?
So Kathy, so when we talk about, you and I had a meeting this morning, so do we have a whole stack of businesses knocking on our door to get some of these places right now? I mean, have we brought in any of the real estate agents, commercial real estate agents, to have a discussion at staff level?
Staff has talked to one real estate agent through this process, and as part of that, there were some folks that were identified, just that were in process. We went then back to do, what were the triggers or the thresholds that we as a city know, because again, we don't know. But what we do know is when someone's pulled a building permit, and we have 3 active tasting rooms that have pulled a building permit and are in process, and we have 2 that have business license, and our understanding is they have signed leases. So those were 5 that were in
I'm not talking about
process.
wine people, I'm talking about people that are other than wine.
I'm sorry, your question again?
People other than wine. In other words, people that are a shoe store or
a
tchotchke store or something like that.
We don't have that information or that list, and did not have time to ask questions about that.
Okay, and then one other question, David, can you put up that map of the comparison 2012-2017? So in our last meeting, we had a discussion about the tax revenue seems to be down in retail. And we all know what's going on with retail and Amazon, et cetera. So my question is all of those little red tasting rooms up here on the left on First Street West? So before 2012, those were offices and homes, if I remember right. I've only been here 26 years, so I don't remember everything. But several of those were homes. In fact, the one on West Spain Street, that was a home as well. I think our city historian lived in that one. So can you give me an idea of how much revenue we were receiving from any of those when they were legal offices or just offices for entrepreneurs, et cetera, and so on?
I don't have that history, nor can I tell you what an individual, but, clearly in terms of a city's tax base, while we get property tax, the city's piece of that property tax is about, I want to say 12 cents, 11, 12 cents. It's not very much of the dollar that's paid comes to the city. So in terms of the greatest revenues that go to fund a city's services, it is sales tax generally number one, and TOT is the other, and property tax is generally the third, and that's kind of what it looks like with us too. So property tax is a piece, but sales tax and TOT are typically.
And then my last question on the tasting rooms that we do have. So when you walk into a tasting room and you buy a $20 tasting, are we collecting tax on that $20 tasting? Let's say they don't buy cases of wine and get a free tasting. Are we collecting tax on that $20 or $50, whatever?
Yes, there is a tax on that tasting.
Thank you.
Ms. Harrington?
I have two questions. On the issue of having a wine bar instead of a tasting room, let's say I wanted to have a tasting room, but there's a moratorium. Why can't I just open a wine bar but only sell my wine from my winery?
Well, I don't want to say that's impossible, but it would be expensive because you would have to buy a Type 42 license to do that. And I also feel that if the council were to adopt a moratorium on wine tasting, we do have a use permit process on wine bar tap rooms, and we can look at what they're proposing and validate what it is they would be doing.
How much is a Type 42 license? Because my understanding was to get a beer and wine license, like for a restaurant, is not particularly expensive or difficult.
Well, it's probably not. Well, I don't want to say it's not expensive. I mean, I wouldn't want to buy one. But, I mean, in the scheme of a business model, it's a couple of $1,000s, so it probably isn't overwhelming in terms of an expense. But a Type 2 is, they've already got.
Yeah, that was my understanding. It was something like not, I mean, if you're going to lease a space for $6 a square foot and then remodel it to be a tasting room, a $2,000 license is not the, definitive factor, probably. And then my second question was, I forgot it, so I'll skip it. Sorry.
Maybe you'll remember it. Any questions from this side? I have a question. The legal non-conforming uses, so do they run with the land, run with the lease, or run with the person?
This is really going to end up being a city attorney's office question, but typically, unless very aggressive measures are taken for something else to happen, it would run with the land.
So even though the person that has, like the person with the use is not the person that owns the land, but it still stays with the person that owns the land?
That's my understanding.
Interesting. Ms. Harrington?
Oh, my other question, which I remembered was, so we need a 4/5 vote for an emergency ordinance, and let's say tonight it's a 3/5 vote and so we do not pass the emergency ordinance, can it be regularly scheduled to have a moratorium with a 3/5 vote in the future?
Yes, it would have to go to the Planning Commission first as a zoning amendment, and then come to the council with a recommendation from the commission.
How does it get on the Planning Commission agenda?
You would just provide that direction as a council.
Thanks.
You have a question?
Yeah, and so it gets onto the planning commission, and then how long does that process take? Is there a thought on that, an idea?
Well, as an amendment to the development code, there'd be a 20-day public notice requirement for the Planning Commission review, and it's a advisory review in essence by the Planning Commission, so they're making a recommendation to the City Council, which is then subject to its own 20-day notice requirement.
Mr. Cook?
Since we're asking the obvious questions, this might be good for public. If tonight we do not pass it with the 4/5 and we decide to give direction to go through, it would be open season for anyone to be available to, like if they went in tomorrow and started the process, they would end up being grandfathered in under the new moratorium?
That's correct. I guess if tonight there's not a 4/5 vote, I guess my recommendation to council would be don't move forward then to try to go to planning commission to bring an urgency item forward. You could do that, but that whole process is going to take probably 60 to 90 days. By 60 to 90 days, that's the amount of time we think it's going to take to research and then go to planning commission. So, I mean, if you don't have a 4/5 to vote to make it urgent and to do the moratorium, you could also on a majority vote just direct staff to move forward and bring some regulatory changes back on tasting room facilities. And now that, you know, we're telling you right now that we'd be back in kind of in the timeline of that April, May. So it's a longer time frame when the door still is open. But it also means that, so that is just another way. You could deal with the urgency ordinance, or you could say just start doing the work and bring it forward as soon as you can.
We have a question over here.
David, if I heard you right, so should there be an emergency moratorium enacted tonight, the 32 or 33, whatever the number is, plus the 5 that are in process, that would lock those guys in with the land for good instead of letting the market take care of itself. We're going to lock in 37.
Well, they already are. I mean, if you weren't to do, whether or not you did a moratorium, we're talking about uses that are or will be legal permitted uses.
Thank you.
So I had a question. So when I sat out there in the audience and listened to this humble sharing of why the smaller wineries wanted to have their wine tasting rooms, because they really didn't have that space on their vineyards, and they wanted to be able to bring them into the city. And I think it was, you know, it was a humble request. I think it made sense. And so I just want to know, with this emergency ordinance, is that what we're calling? Is that, will we be able to actually get the facts of all of what's going on with this growth that's gone on? I've told people who have written me or called me, I have a perception that there is a proliferation of wine tasting rooms in Sonoma. I don't have the facts. I can see it with my eyes. I feel it as a perception. But what I want from the moratorium is a couple of things. I need some information about sales tax because I don't know what benefits we have. I want to know, as it was presented years ago when I was not on the council, I also want to know what wineries are here in Sonoma. Initially, I think it was presented that it would be wineries in the valley or in proximity to the city of Sonoma, and I have not seen that. However, that's my perception, and so I'm really interested in doing something like this because I don't know. I just feel it's beneficial to us as our community character. I understand about the wine industry. I'm just so proud and excited to live here. But there are a lot of issues that involve this issue of our wine tasting rooms. And I'm so very interested in getting those real answers. So that's what I'm hoping that we'll get out of this moratorium, are real answers and not my perception or the perception of people who live here.
And at that, if there are no further questions at this time, we are going to go out to the public for public comment. Just a reminder, it's 3 minutes, and please begin with your name and your address.
Good evening. My name is Georgia Kelly, and I live on Mitchell Way in Sonoma. And I just want to urge the council tonight to vote for a moratorium to give everyone time, not only on the council, but in the community, to reassess what we have with our wine tasting rooms. I still don't know the difference between a wine tasting room and a wine bar, so maybe somebody can clue me in as to what the difference is, because I don't know. And I didn't the last time I came here, because to me it seems like tasting rooms have morphed into wine bars. And, you know, that where they charge, and there's a different idea than there was originally when wine tasting rooms first existed. People had little tastes of different wines, and it was free. And I don't think that's the case in any of these rooms any longer. So I want to urge the council to vote for the moratorium, give us time as a community as well as the council to re-look at this picture, because it's gotten way out of hand in the last few years. And I also want to urge you to consider having a public forum where people in the community can get together, give you input as a group, and talk about it among themselves. I think this is an issue that when I talk to people in the community, they're quite on fire, usually thinking that it's been overblown, that we have too many wine tasting rooms on the plaza. And so let's let the community have a voice in this, in a forum. I would like to encourage you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Toll Merritt, Donner Avenue. 6th generation Sonoma on my mother's side. Family moved here 1858. 3rd generation on my father's side moved here 1952. Closest census statistics on my mother's side in 1890 was a population of 757 people. My grandmother joked about moving to an 8-acre plaza with a 1-acre town. My grandmother on my father's side moved here in 1952, closest census 1950-2015. When she moved here, she mentioned how the locals were concerned about all the new people and the changing town. Graduated El Verano, Altamira, Sonoma High, Sonoma State. Worked in the wine industry for 25 years. Provide farm services on 700 acres of vineyards in the Sonoma Valley. I love Sonoma. Points to make quickly: any limitations to where a bunch of grapes as wine can be sold comes at a cost to the farmer, harms the employees and the families economically. It serves to limit opportunity for myself and my children. The tasting rooms that are on the plaza are the smallest, least corporate, most family owned. It's oftentimes the only route to market for these producers. And by passing an ordinance like this, it plays right into the hands of large multinational, oftentimes billion-dollar companies. Sonoma's small town feel. I was in the Mosel in Krug, Germany. Population 2,200 people, 40 wineries, A to Z production within city limits. Interned at Chambon-Musigny, France. Population 315, domains 20. I realized that with all of the new people, that Sonoma politics is shifting predictably more towards the populace and less towards agriculture and the generations that have relied upon it. And I don't have much time. I think there's no better example of the framing of this issue and how potentially it's disingenuous. Saying that it's a small town, first, as defined by the same new people who have moved here in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, seems to be at conflict with those of us that have been here for longer. Now, I don't think it's an us and them argument. My point is not to ignore The issues of the council, traffic, parking, safety, and budgets, parks. My point is not to limit the council's desire for more knowledge and understanding, personally, even if that's a pause button. My point is not to demonize the influx of new people into the community and the increased population effects on the wine industry and its politics. My point is simple. Don't try to pick winners and losers. My great-grandfathers, Jacob Gundlach, Charles Bundschuh,
I'll
left
give you about
Germany.
10 more seconds.
Okay, left Germany because of medieval associations called guilds, and that would not allow them to freely operate their business.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.
Hi, Fred Allebach, 19550 8th Street East. And I'd like to point out that my ancestors came to this country in 1648 on the invitation of William Penn. And my ancestors were Mennonite farmers who were known for being good land stewards. And I'm a 13th generation descendant of that. So I'm not a new person in this country. I'm a citizen of the United States. And I have a right to have my opinion on the town that I live in and the matters that are going on here. I would recommend that the council do make a moratorium on the Plaza Historic Overlay. I think that will push the pause button and allow important community discussion to happen that's been percolating for years. And this is a due diligence of the council to measure the populace and the citizens here as they stand today. That was part of the staff report, and that's part of the dynamic here, is that Sonoma is evolving. It's not stuck in the past. Sonoma is what it is today. And the people who are here have to reckon with the tensions and pressures and issues that are here now. So I think that will be your due diligence to push the pause button and to allow a community discussion to go on that will vet these issues that have been known countywide. Is always in the paper about this same tension, the balancing tourism with residents. So there's a big community discussion that deserves to happen, and I think that people who are on all sides of this can work in good faith to have their opinions and work out something good here. I think that just as a background, there's a market conflict between direct sales and tasting rooms on the plaza, people who don't have vineyards and people who have vineyards who are the tourists are going to one place or another. So this is fueling pressure for more event centers in the countryside, and that's not necessarily an agricultural use. So there's a big picture to this, and Sonoma was recently rated the #8 drinking destination in the United States. So is that the kind of, and then now we're talking about pot, we got hard liquor, maybe we should just put a Doritos store on the side of the plaza, and then everybody can get messed up and go eat Doritos until they can drive when they're done. Sorry about bad joke there. But I think that it would be wise to have a moratorium and allow this community discussion that people have been talking about for a while, and I encourage you to do the moratorium in the plaza retail overlay.
Thank you.
Josette Broziker, 1110 Loma Court. This thing never stays down here. Many people say to me, why do you stick your nose in city business when you live in the Springs? On the issue, like many others, I feel those of us outside the city limits have a stake in what happens in the business community in the city. I choose to do 90% of my shopping, dining, and use of services here in Sonoma and not go to Napa or Santa Rosa. I think the trend to replacing other businesses with tasting rooms will change this. The theory that other businesses will just move to the strip malls and away from downtown is flawed. We have 3 of these malls and they are full. This means that more malls will be built in the Springs, or will you allow more to be built in the city? And that will not happen overnight. And even if this does happen, then do you have a downtown of tasting rooms with all other businesses in the outlying areas? I urge you to do a moratorium and careful study. of what will happen long-term if tasting rooms do not have some type of cap on numbers and density. I urge you to contract a rigorous analysis and study based on hard data and not anecdotal evidence. There are many towns out there going through this same type of dynamic. There is ample data to look at. When I was involved in vacation rental issue at the county level because I own one, I was disappointed in the study data used. It was incomplete and drew conclusions that were not supported by data. Though I am a wedding florist now, I know of what I speak. I was a systems analyst for Visa credit card, my first career incarnation. Any study must include the use of financial data to project the long-term effects of allowing unlimited numbers of tasting rooms. There are two aspects the city needs to think about. What is the long-term financial viability once the numbers increase? Can they all be profitable and keep operating? Or will you have a glut of empty storefronts at some point with inflated expectation from landlords of what they are worth? And what is the long-term effect on sales tax revenue? The tasting room business model is to sign up wine club members, not to collect sales tax from wine sold on site. There is social and economic impact here. I urge you to implement a moratorium and contract a careful study. Please get 4 votes. Please have a pause and do a careful study. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Armando Zimmerman, West Spain Street. My first question is, I got lost in the exchange between Mr. Edwards and the city manager regarding business applications, I guess, for other than wine retail. And I guess I didn't get whether there are none, or are they, does the market sort it out just because of the cost of rental spaces or whatever? So that's a question. I'm confused about that. Secondly, several years ago, the church across the street from us applied for a use permit, and basically the use permit, as I looked at it, it seemed pretty benign. But when I looked at it more closely, basically they were asking for to be able to operate 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Probably 6 days a week. I think that was the large scope of what they wanted to do. And as a church, it appeared to me and a couple of the other neighbors that they were really trying to become an event center in addition to a church. And I had no problem with the church trying to increase their revenues. On the other hand, I live across the street, and it seemed bananas. So I raised some issues, and a couple other people did also. There were some curbing of what that church asked for in their use permit. You mentioned, Mr. Hollabach mentioned, the need for event centers and wedding places and everything else is just growing. Now, I would ask that this moratorium would give us time to also take a look at these residential areas. I mean, who came first in the city? I mean, I know that, people talk about their heritage and the agricultural aspect. I don't have a problem with that, but I also know that when I live next to a, quotes, business that's expanding its scope, that's trying to run, longer hours, more days, and so forth, it changes my neighborhood. And so I would ask that we also look at those issues, because I think there's a lot of mixed use areas in this in these shaded areas that we're talking about. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, David Eicher, 1110 Loma Court. I have one question for you. Do you want to have tasting rooms across from a high school? How about a middle school or elementary school? If the answer is no, or I am not sure, then please put a moratorium in place on new tasting rooms throughout the city. Then the city can decide later whether that's okay or not. But if you're not sure, the moratorium is worth it. From the map showing the existing tasting rooms and wine bars, you can see that moving down Broadway and First Street West. So at a minimum, if you don't do the entire city, you should do the downtown, Broadway corridor, and gateway districts. Because even you have a wine bar down by the Fat Pilgrim just outside of town. When the city adopted its current rules, the argument was the small wineries needed some place because they couldn't do it have wine tasting on their property. But if you look at the tasting rooms that's been open, you'll see a lot have production facilities at 8th Street East in Napa or Napa. Some even have tasting rooms in these facilities. And while you also see some wineries such as Shug, who have tasting rooms at their winery, want a second one in town or want to move their tasting room. And why do wineries want to move into a city? Well, because the city is going to be Sonoma, because both Healdsburg and Santa Rosa and others have put restrictions on the number of locations. And so we have maybe 8 or 10 tasting rooms of wineries from West County or the Russian River that would go to Healdsburg if they could. But so they're coming here. We also have one winery, tasting room on the Plaza, that is owned by a company in British Columbia. And according to the Valley of the Moon magazine, one winery here in tasting room, the owner lives in New Jersey, buys grapes from all over California, makes wine in Napa, and sells it in Sonoma. So we need a moratorium. Now, I belong to 4 wine clubs, including Ganak Bunshu, and I enjoy going out to the wineries rather than being in the tasting rooms. And also in here is a quote from Mike Benzinger that I'll read it to you here. The town of Sonoma has made it very appealing for people to stay in perfectly nice hotels around the plaza and not venture up valley. That means they often get an eretz, not an authentic experience. So please put it the moratorium so we can figure out what you want to do. You don't have to decide exactly what you want to do tonight. There's a lot more discussion, a lot more information to be gotten. I just recently received from David Goodison a list of all the Type 2 licenses around the city of Sonoma, not just within the city, and a lot of them are from corporations outside the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the plug. My name is Jim Bunshu, and I reside at 2000 Denmark Street. This is strictly educational. I only have 3 minutes. It's not our fault that there's only 3 or 4% of the world's surface that can grow great grapes. Not just general grapes, but great grapes. Sonoma Valley happens to be one of the 3 or 4%. On the other side of that scale, fast forwarding, there are 300 wine brands in the world, top wine brands, sold by 5 distributors in the United States that sell 94.6% of the wines in the United States. Where does that leave the small little vineyardist? When my discussion is over, I'm going to melt it down to just a bunch of grapes. Having lived here so long and having been a farming family, vineyards are the last surviving commercial possible crop that will grow in Sonoma Valley that cannot be done better and more economically and profitably somewhere else. So if vineyards disappear, so does our agricultural land. There's no backup. Marijuana, perhaps, some of the truck farms for restaurants, certainly, but that's not going to take up the acreage that provides open spaces to our Sonoma Valley residents. As Toll already mentioned, and I'm not going to tell you what you should or should not do, but you're playing right into the hands of the large wineries who can market their wines on a large scale and don't need tasting rooms. So the tasting rooms will be engendered into the larger wineries. Getting back to the bunch of grapes, it's simple for you to remember. A bunch of grapes needs to be crushed and marketed. If the grower can't sell that bunch of grapes and that winery cannot market him, the winery cannot buy the grapes. Very simple economics. And without a healthy retail wine industry, the bunches of grapes will not be purchased by the wineries. And that is a fact that Sonoma Valley's reputation is built on fine artisan wines. And in order to do that, wines need to be made in an artisanal fact in small quantities. And we can't compete with the large corporate wineries. We need retail space. Where we find it, very difficult in the town of Sonoma, very difficult in the county. If the tasting rooms around Sonoma Plaza there's a moratorium, and let's say that we already have reached a tipping point with tourists, and there's already a lot of tourists here, so we become a Carmel, and there are lots of artists here and selling paintings, jewelry stores, whatever. Those people don't buy bunches of grapes. So we could have a great tourist town here, we already do, but the people who aren't purchasing bunches of grapes aren't helping to preserve the landscape around the city that you all are destined to
give you
cover.
about 10 more
here.
seconds.
Okay, so I'm just thinking with a moratorium, as long as it lasts, you're going to not deny someone who wants to make 500 cases or 1,000 cases and plan on having a tasting room in the city of Sonoma or somewhere in the Sonoma Valley the right to do this. He'll be shut out of business.
Okay, thank you very much.
So please consider this.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment on this item?
Good evening. My name is Jeanette Fung, and I live on 7th Street East. I already wrote a letter to the council, so I won't go through that again. But in my prior life, I was a commercial real estate appraiser for Bank of America, Chase Manhattan Bank, and Security Pacific Bank. And I appraised a lot of malls, a lot of hotels, a lot of ag land in my past life. I do know one thing from my experience with all these banks is that if there's a overconcentration of any one product in a commercial district, it will not only make for a very uninteresting commercial district, but then if that particular product, in this case wineries, goes through any kind of a downturn, then the whole commercial market is impacted. And you may end up with a lot of empty storefronts. Now, the reason why there might be empty storefronts is not necessarily because there's no interest in leasing it, but oftentimes it's because the landlords have unrealistic rents that they're seeking. In our particular case, I do strongly believe that because so much of our plaza is in the hands of a very few number of people that do not have the normal economic pressures to wheel and deal on negotiating rents, they could afford to sit there with those empty storefronts until they get their rents. It's not because there's no interest in it. When I had my former space vacant, I cannot tell you how many inquiries I received. Now, some of them were a little bit harebrained, but there was no lack of interest. Where it broke down was what the landlord wanted. So when you have a healthy economic market and it's give and take, and the landlord's got to meet their mortgage and their obligations, and there's a tenant who may not be able to pay you top rent, but has a viable business idea, then the landlord is forced to have to go into negotiations. We don't have that right now. Right now, there's always the wineries. So I really do think that we should look at doing a moratorium right now and truly finding out what is it that the citizenry here in Sonoma want. And, at the end of the day, we all live here. The tourists go home, the wedding's done, we're still here. And that's the most important thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment on this item? Seeing none, I will bring it back to the council for discussion and possible action. Who would like to get us started? Vice Mayor Edwards.
So, Fred, my family beat you here by 2 years, 1646 in New York. Yeah, I mean, listening to the comments, I mean, I have to be honest, I don't see We have 11,000 people who live in this town. I don't see 11,000 people here. And I've had 3 emails on this. One or two about finding a way to do a moratorium, but not in any of the information has anybody come up with. What are we going to replace? Are we going to put a Apple store on Plaza? Are we going to put a Formula store? And we can't do that because we already made sure that didn't happen. The speakers at our last meeting talked about, a majority of the speakers here tonight, talk about a living wage, and one of the speakers came up and the study that they did was a $22 an hour average wage in tasting rooms. And previous speakers earlier wanted to talk about affordable housing, the Broadway project, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, here we are, we have a machine that's working. We still have the same number of tasting rooms that are facing the plaza. I don't know how, I've been to Healdsburg 3 times in the last 2 weeks. I don't know how often our council has gone to Healdsburg or to St. Helena. I mean, I work in all of those places. And, I just have to be honest, I really don't go into tasting rooms. I have one tasting room that I'm a member of, only because my wife made me do it. And it's called Sonoma Loeb. And they source their grapes from the San Giacomos and other places. And we had this discussion earlier about, well, we're going to find out where we're sourcing things. We can't even enforce our smoking ordinance. We can't enforce a whole bunch of things that we do. Our noise ordinance, leaf blowers, I mean, the whole 9 yards. And so now we're going to try to tell wineries where they should buy their grapes and how they're going to buy their grapes, and we're going to get a panel of experts together to figure out where those grapes came from. I just don't see that happening. And these are part of the previous discussions. When you look at these buildings that are around the corners, I had a cheese store on East Napa Street. Boy, it was tough to get people to walk in that building. And the thousands and thousands of dollars that I had to pay to remodel that building, to do ADA, to do all of the things that I had to do. You look at these 33 places, the city has retrieved revenue from building permits, contractors, all kinds of stuff, ADA improvements, I mean, you name it. A lot of these buildings have been upgraded to a point where they're actually pretty nice now. When I look at the Pangloss building, that had 4 or 5 different tasting rooms in there now, or combined. Now it's just 1. So before, when it was 4 or 5, there would be 10 cars parked there for all the people that are working there. And then, of course, people come in and do their thing. But now you have 1 operator there, so you have fewer people actually operating a business like that. And, I'm sorry that I see things a little bit differently than it appears the majority of my council based on our last meeting. But these buildings that are tucked around corners, the guy who has the little, I can't remember, David, what do you call it? The guy that's in the Mercado down by La Salette. You go around the back alley and there's a music venue there.
That's the Sonoma Speakeasy. That's a wine bar,
And that
in
was
essence, tap room.
Yeah, so wine bar and tap room, that was something that was a huge controversy at that time, but it actually has worked out pretty well because most people don't even know actually where it is. And I just don't see the urgency. I'm a firm believer in free market, and the free market will take care of itself. When we talk about if there were 50 here, I mean, I don't walk into a tasting room when I'm on the Plaza weekend. I go to Large Leather, I go to Araldi's, I go to Breakaway. My wife and I, we work the Plaza first for our holiday shopping. That's just how we live. But, are we going to start putting moratoriums on the number of dress shops or the number of, I mean, you name it. There's multiples of everything. There's men's stores. Do we start putting a moratorium and try to tell people what to do with their money? I don't think that's the job of government. The KCBS radio had a quote by our mayor and somebody who worked in a tasting room that said, oh, there's just a bunch of drunks walking around. And this fellow apparently said he worked in a tasting room, but I have no idea where they got that information. But we hit the regional press, And I thought it was a little unfair because they didn't really talk to anybody. No offense to the mayor, but I'm talking about people that are actually in the business and naming the folks that they spoke to besides our mayor. I just, I have commercial real estate in Petaluma that is empty right now because it's at an airport. I've had cannabis people come in and want to rent it. I can't do it because it's a federal facility. And my wife is a banker, and as a couple, we don't have anything to do with something that can't be banked. And it's a rule that we stand by. I don't see the, Mr. Bunchu got up and spoke about the dynamics. We're thinking about wine, and we get wine in a bottle, but then do we have the mechanic that fixes the trucks, right? You start thinking of Councilmember Cook, who goes out and grows grapes for certain people. There's so many other things that happen as a result of our wine industry. And if it does go away, let's just go build a whole bunch of houses. We could probably put 40,000 homes in the valley. I think that I think that if we don't pay attention to what our #1 industry is here, that we're going to have issues, and I'll probably have a couple of comments after you guys are finished with your conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for keeping it civil. Councilmember Harrington?
Oh, well, it was just a question, Councilmember Edwards. It occurred to me that you own real property on the plaza that would be affected by this ordinance, and I was wondering if you'd be allowed to vote on this or not.
I don't own property on the plaza. I own it just off the plaza.
But I mean, it could be affected by this moratorium, and that's a question for the city attorney, and I apologize for.
Yeah, but not in any way, because it's a long-term lease and it actually belongs to my trust and to my children already. And I understand it's still my property.
That's right, yeah.
So if you don't want me to vote on it, I'll be happy not to.
I
Thank you.
am happy for you to vote or not. It's just a legal question about whether or not you're allowed to vote on it, and it was a question for the city attorney.
Could we have some advice on the question, please?
Mr. Edwards, is your property located in the downtown Plaza Retail District?
Yes, it is. And then I would just like, while you're looking that information up, council member to my right here, she owns a property within 500 feet of a tasting room. So would it affect your property?
If I'm not allowed to vote on this matter, I have a property at 235 East Napa. I'm happy not to vote on it. It's not a personal attack. It's a question about the law. Are you allowed to vote on it or not? It's just a question.
Well, not knowing all the facts, of course, of ownership, et cetera, I always give advice that's conservative when it comes to conflict of interest. And if you have property within an area that's being addressed by the council tonight, I recommend that you not participate.
So then when we vote on the Paley art exhibit downtown, I shouldn't be voting on that as well, just because I happen to own a piece of property.
No, the question is whether that the action of the council may have a reasonably foreseeable financial effect on an interest that you have, an economic interest. You have a long-term lease, but I'm not sure that a long-term lease removes the issue of the impact that it might have.
And I'm happy not to vote on this, but it'll change the dynamics, which is just fine.
Well, then if it's the case of someone that can't vote on something, then they can't be up here on the dais, correct?
That is the recommendation, yeah.
So can we take a 5-minute recess?
Yes.
I don't know. You guys figure it out.
Underwriting is provided by Sonoma Paint Center, located at 815 West Napa Street. For more information, you can go to sonomapaintcenter.com. And Larbury Automotive, located at 18155 Sonoma Highway. For more information, you can go to larburyauto.com.
to bring this meeting back to order, and we'll pass it over to our city attorney for some thoughts.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to begin with just a brief description of what's before the council tonight. It's an urgency ordinance that is controlled by a government code section 65858. That section allows city councils and board of supervisors to adopt basically zoning-like measures. This is a land use decision. You're freezing the type of uses allowed in this particular district. But you're not following the normal zoning amendment or zoning ordinance procedures. If you want to adopt a zoning amendment, as you well know, it first has to go to the Planning Commission after notice and public hearing. The commission then makes a recommendation to the council. The council has a first reading and hearing, and has a second reading and adoption, and there's a 30-day wait period. This section, 65858, allows you to skip all of that. All of that. You don't even have to notify, in fact you didn't, you don't have to provide advance public notice other than have this particular item included in your agenda packet that went out last week. That's the only advance notice required, and that's common for any item that's on tonight's agenda. So you're able to skip all the normal procedural protections that surround the adoption of a land use decision or ordinance. However, there's a catch. You have to have 5 council members approve it. I'm sorry, 4. I said 5. I meant 4. You have to have 4 council members approve this urgency ordinance tonight in order for it to go into effect. That's where the 4-vote requirement comes from. It comes from this section 65858 of the government code. That's the trade-off. You can skip procedures, but you need 4 of you to vote and declare that there's sufficient urgency to adopt it without following the normal procedures. All right, so that sets the framework here. You need 4 votes. We now have an issue that's come up that maybe a couple council members have property that's within or in the district that's affected by this proposed ordinance. And I've recommended at a very conservative advice for Mr. Edwards to step down and not participate. I'm making similar recommendation to Ms. Harrington, and she'd like to explain a little bit about her situation.
Well, first, just because of the emotion of the evening, I'd like to say that I welcome all council members having their say about any topic. It's just that while Councilmember Edwards was speaking and I was looking at the map of the Historic Overlay District, which is the subject of the hearing, I realized and recalled that he owned real property in that area, and I did not want any of us to get in trouble with the FPPC. Councilmember Edwards then said, where I own property, which is not in the historic overlay, but is not within 500 feet of any tasting room, but is downtown, it's on the east side, that I might also have a conflict. So I don't think I have a conflict. I can't imagine that I do. But in deference to the suggestion that I possibly have a conflict, of course, I don't want to participate in this hearing until I'm sure I don't, and I never would do that, and I don't want to do anything that would jeopardize the integrity of the council, and I'm happy to step down and talk to the FPPC and find out if I'm allowed to vote on it or not.
And at this point, since we are down to 3, do I have to wait till she leaves? We will wait. We have a closed session after this. You can't leave.
Can I stay in here?
Go outside.
It feels like law and order right now.
So if we wanted to continue this to our next meeting, can we pass that with our tiny council?
You can. I'm recommending you just continue it because we don't know
So I just continue it.
The motion would be to continue it to a date that the staff, after hearing from the FPPC, can bring it back. We don't know how long the FPPC may take to respond to inquiries about these issues.
Oh, you can call and get an opinion immediately.
It depends on the level of security that each individual council member wants or believes that he or she needs. You can actually send an email to the FPPC, which I have frequently done, and get advice within 2 to 10 hours. But it's very informal. It's not binding on the FPPC. We need to remember that the FPPC is the enforcing agent in the state of California that can bring administrative sanctions and penalties against individual council members and boards of supervisor members who don't comply with this particular part of the law. So it's up to the council member individually how much security he or she needs from the FPPC before participating. The other option is to get a formal advice letter, and that takes about 20 to 30 days from the FPPC. So I don't know what level of protection each of your fellow council members may seek. So I think we need to play a little bit by ear here and continue the matter to a time that's not certain at the present time, and we'll bring it back when we can.
Well, could we continue it until October 23rd, but if it still is not, we're not ready with enough people, we could continue it again?
Yes, that's an option. The city manager was inquiring whether the council could direct staff, the majority, to direct staff to begin looking at investigating regulations that might be appropriately applicable to wine tasting facilities in the interim. And I said, certainly, if the council wishes the staff to begin looking at the regulations in the interim, the city council could do that.
Mr. Cook?
I would like to make a motion that we hold off on discussion until we have a continuance for tonight, and I would not want to give direction. I'm not for that, so my vote would be no on that.
I agree.
Do we have a second?
Second.
So the second is to just continue this to the 23rd of October.
Yeah, and I agree. I feel I think that to have the most beneficial discussion on this subject, that we need to go back, prepare ourselves for that discussion, and then see what our team looks like on the 23rd.
So just before a vote, I just would like to ask the maker of the motion, Councilmember Cook, your motion was to continue to October 23rd. If we don't have a fourth member to sit here or the full body, at that point is your motion also that with the staff, I don't want to put on the agenda if we're not ready. So then it would come back at the next available meeting. I just would like some clarification on that.
I think that, and I have beautiful notes that could explain that if I would have been able to speak, but we had the recusals. And the reason I'm calling for dismissal is I've always said this is something we have to be very careful. I was quoted in the newspaper, and I said it from the dais, that when government gets involved, sometimes things go awry. I was going to support having a moratorium that was the shortest period length in time, because I just felt that the pressures coming from Healdsburg, Calistoga, St. Helena, and all the different issues. And I don't know what the right answer is, but I know what the wrong answer is. And the wrong answer is to send any information out there to people that there's going to be a moratorium in tasting rooms unless you have this in place. Because what I want to do is I want to protect the local farmers. I think that this is a great venue for them to be. Sometimes, and this is why I make that comment about government, because if we give direction without this, I wouldn't be doing my job, because that's not what I believe in. And that was my whole speech tonight. And you know, I think it's great that we're looking at it. I think that every other city has looked at it. But without that, I don't even want anybody to, we'll just go on with regular business. And if we do put it on a re-agenda, if we feel that we have enough, the 4/5, I still don't understand that. Because if there's only 3 of us, then there would be no reason to even have the discussion. So I just don't want to send false information.
Well, I think you've hit it right on the head, Councilmember Cook. If you only have 3 up there, this ordinance cannot be adopted as an urgency ordinance. It has to go through the normal process. That's the trade-off. You have to have 4 votes, not 4/5 of whoever happens to be up there. It's 4 votes of the entire council. So you have to have 4 people, 4 council members vote affirmatively for this ordinance. So if 2 of your fellow council members have a disqualifying interest, and the FPPC indicates that they shouldn't be participating, then this will not be coming back to you at all in this form.
And so I think the clarification, one, if we are indeed continuing this to October 23rd, and then the suggested contingency was that if we find out before the 23rd that we're not going to have 4 eligible council members, then we're not going to put it on the agenda. Is that right?
Yes.
Is that what you're suggesting, perhaps?
Or if we don't know by that date, we would want to be able to put it on a future agenda at an appropriate time.
Mr. Cook?
And I think the only thing I probably should have said, and I was going to say it before, is I've looked into my situation, just because the press is going to pick this up, that there's 2 other members that had to recuse themselves. Why didn't Cook have to recuse himself? I've looked into it. I feel very comfortable being up here on the dais, and it's all transparent, for me to be up here. So I just wanted to set the record, straight there.
Okay, so do we need to suggest an amendment to the motion? Can we amend the motion to include, if we know we're not going to have 4 eligible council members at the next meeting, then we will not have it on the agenda?
Yeah, I'd amend it to that.
I expect to get the answer before then.
Well,
We have legislators, that's what that's for. I've worked for them. And all you have to do is make a call, and they have different kind of relationships with these agencies. I don't understand why that issue, don't want to amend it. I still think it's very important. People need to know it's serious, and I won't accept anything less than that. But you can vote against.
I guess maybe just one other comment. I think we could come back on October 23rd. We have clarity and you've got enough votes to move forward and to vote on whether you want to do the urgency ordinance. The other option of council, though, is not to do the urgency ordinance. It may not be what you all want to do, but to also then just ask staff to begin to look at regulations and bring something forward going through a normal process. That is another option that the council has. It may not be one that everyone wants to pursue, but that is another option that sits before you.
But tonight, the question is whether you're going to continue this item to the 23rd, and if it's not ready to be brought back to you on the 23rd because we do not have a decision from the commission, or we have decisions that indicate that 2 of your fellow council members can't participate, then the item would not appear on the October 23rd agenda. That's the motion we'd ask you to make.
Mr. Cook?
I'd like to change my motion to that we table this item till further information is provided from the FPPC.
Can we continue an item in that fashion? I thought it had to be to a date certain.
Yes, you can. This is a substitute motion, and it would need a second, and if it's passed, then the first motion is not going to be acted upon.
And so does that mean that if we found out between here and October 23rd, then it could appear on that? Or, okay, so that just leaves it open-ended and flexible. Is our second amenable?
Since it's a substitute motion, some other council member, i.e. the mayor, could second it.
I will second that. Can we pass it with a 2-person vote? All right. All right, substitute motion.
Majority of the quorum.
Take our vote on it. Can I have a roll call vote, please?
Councilmember Agramonte?
No.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Mayor Henley?
Aye.
Thank you.
All right. And with that, let's see. Where's my agenda? Item 7 is council members' reports and comments.
The other council members are invited to come back at this point,
Oh, Miss Harrington, you can come back.
and Mr. Edwards also.
Oh, I thought he left.
They made this contingent on comfort from the FPPC when actually it's an individual council decision, participate or not participate. So they should really make a contingent on having their 4 people. If the FPPC may not give an advice letter in the time, but if Mrs. Worthington, for instance, decides that it's not a material question, she can, without the FPPC, she can go back and actually participate, right? So, I mean, they're limiting themselves by adding it to the FPPC. It should be.
Item number 7 is council member reports and comments. Do we have any reports and or comments?
My only comment is that Councilmember Edwards is outside, but somebody just reported a possible crime to him, so he was contacting the sheriff to help that person out.
Which we could wait for, but I don't think he'd want us to wait.
Curiouser and curiouser. Thank you so much for that report.
Any other comments and/or reports? Item number 8, city manager comments and announcements.
None tonight.
And at this time, we will be retiring into closed session.
Yes, you'll need to do a public comment on that closed session. Also, just wanted to communicate to the public, our next meeting would typically be October 16th. It actually, staff has recommended that we move the meeting to October 23rd. This is for some noticing issues that we have with the upcoming cannabis urgency ordinances. So we will not have a meeting on the 16th. We'll have it on October 23rd. And because we don't want that to be a special meeting, we need it to be a regular meeting so we can act on those cannabis urgency ordinance extensions. The council will need to, and mayor, to continue as you close this meeting, we go into closed session, you will need to close and continue this meeting to the date of October 23rd.
Okay.
Adjourn it, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I just wanted to remind anyone watching in the public that the application for the Planning Commission is now online, it's live, and anybody who's interested in applying for the Planning Commission can do that on the city website.
Thank you. Our item for closed session will be public employee performance evaluation to discuss and determine process pursuant to Government Code Section 54957. And at this time, I will open the floor for public comment on this matter. Seeing none, I will bring it back to the council, and we will retire into closed session.
So you're going, when you come back, make sure you adjourn to the October 23 meeting.
I continue it, right? I don't
You
adjourn?
continue and adjourn.
Oh, okay. Got it.
So you'll do that later, right? All right, thank you.